Narrative commercials are all about crafting a story. It's your job as a filmmaker to make everyday scenarios visually interesting. We've all been there, trying to keep a scene consistent, wondering why one shot looks different from the next, or just figuring out how to make a scene feel like a complete story. Today, we're breaking down how to add shot variety without losing that flow so your scenes feel natural and connected. Whether you're dealing with camera angles, timing, or lighting, we've got you covered. Let's dive into how to make each shot count by breaking down a few scenes in a montage commercial. What we're gonna be looking at here is a recent kind of real estate commercial. It's a montage commercial of many stories happening at the same time. That's what the essence of montage is. When you have multiple characters or a single character playing out different kind of scenarios and stories. In this story that we're following here, kind of down this rabbit hole, is this couple meeting up after work, going on a date, and then having a picnic. To really focus on the fundamentals of how to drive a narrative, especially in commercial work or any filmmaking, and that's basically through shot variety as well as continuity. And continuity is huge, and it's one of those things that when you see it, you know it's wrong, and when you don't see it, you know that everything just flows properly. And we're gonna get into all those rules and how kind of a rule of thumb, what to do in scenarios and how to really approach a scene, especially when you're thinking about continuity in mind. So I'm gonna go over how we approach this scene and what we had to do to get the variety of shots, and also go over positioning when it comes to lighting as well as continuity. We have our male talent here, his name is Jordan, and then our female talent over here, which is Kat. So yeah, if we kind of just set the scene, he's waiting here, and then this is just another tight coverage of that. Then they meet up and then they leave. So it's just like, how do you go into this to get the best looking shots, as well as creatively shooting this so it makes sense when you get to the edit? Because the biggest thing is, when we've shot a lot of montage commercials, we're like, yeah, that's a great idea, let's shoot it. And then we shoot it like how we're supposed to. And then when we get to the edit, this doesn't make any sense at all. And the main thing is getting a lot of coverage and shot variety. If you notice here, we actually have 2 telephoto wides that kind of set the scene and kind of bring you back out in this narrative feel. You have to ask yourself as a cinematographer, especially in narrative commercial work, are you supposed to be inside the action or outside the action? And in this case, we kind of have moments where we're inside and outside. So that's the first thing I'm going to explore with this whole setting the scene of where we are. So basically, I want to give some context to the viewer that we are inside a subway station and what I'm supposed to be looking at. And kind of everything is pointing towards my main talent here, and he's kind of in the thirds, and that's just proper composing as well as shooting on a long lens. I believe here we're shooting on a 135, and this was on the Venice. I'm not gonna go too much into camera settings here because everything was pretty standard. We're shooting basically with no lights, just showing up on location. We obviously had a permit because we had an easy rig and basically a full crew there, and somebody was pulling focus. And the only thing I really had on standby was a floppy as well as a bounce card, but I didn't actually end up using them. And this was just due to talent positioning and just knowing where to put my talent, especially with the lights you're dealing in each scenario. So this is establishing the scene of that this character is waiting for somebody or something. In this case, we don't really know if it's somebody yet, but that's what we're going to assume. And then we jump into the sequence to this shot where we see what he's waiting for. And then actually in the edit, you kind of see the lights start to appear here. Unfortunately, I just don't have this still, but that's just another continuity thing in the edit to say like, oh, the train is approaching. And that kind of gives you a hint. If you didn't necessarily have that hint to kind of portray where we're going to next, those are the little details that really drive a narrative forward and help a scene really feel complete when you're going from shot to shot. Because that's the last thing you want to do where you have something feel incomplete. So we have that train coming, and then this is me jumping up on a focal length. I was usually jumping between a 40 mil and the 135. So at this point, we're on the 40 and we're getting this coverage here. In the sequence, this is how this shot, but in actuality, this was shot second because we were on a subway platform and we only wanted to get the shot in maybe 2 to 3 trains coming by, because every time that we wanted to shoot the wide, we shot the whole entire wide of the subway train coming in, the girl coming out, and then them leaving together. So you would shoot that entire scene here, you shoot that entire action here again, shoot it here again, and then also shoot it here with some kind of intercuts in between. So we kind of shot it in, I'll show you the direction of 1, 2, 3, and then 4. And this is how we shot it, but in actuality, it kind of flows of how this kind of flows. So like back to here and then here. So that's just something to keep in mind. And the main reason I did this is because of focal lengths. The director and I are pretty aligned of what the story's supposed to look like already. So we knew that we wanted to get these telephoto wides of them kind of interacting and then him standing there. So we knew that exactly the action and everything from there. And then we swapped lenses and when we did the same action all over again. So it's just taking that 5 minutes again at the beginning before we even start moving into things, aligning with the director and say like, hey, we're gonna stay on this long lens and get this reaction shot down here just so we can speed things up so I don't have to keep swapping between lenses. Because I only had to do one lens swap here and not 4. So that really adds up in time when you're going back and forth. So now we're at this medium shot of him kind of looking down the tunnel. And then we have these nice strip lights and just a bunch of leading lines. And the location made everything easy of where we're supposed to be looking. We're looking also at him, but we're also looking at the strain of like, oh, what's he looking for? What's coming down there? And then just going into the whole positioning thing, I am going to stay on this side. I'm not necessarily going to hop my shoulder. And this is going to be another example that we're going to be looking at later when it comes to continuity and everything feels right. And the main important thing in situations where you don't necessarily have time to light is always stay on your subject's shadow side. I have all this light coming from here, and that's establishing where I'm going to necessarily put my camera. It gives me a nice light on this side, which it's kind of ugly when we look at the colors, but just how the colors push it and everything looks pretty well balanced. And then we have this natural fall off and shadow and heavy contrast on the other side. I don't remember if this point we just had somebody walk in a floppy here, but if you wanted a different contrast ratio, you could 100% do that. Or if you want it a little bit lifted to pop him out even more, but this light pops him out just between the contrast ratio of that. We're not necessarily getting any light from this because it's so far away and the light is pointed directly down. So this just goes into positioning. And then if you wanted something that was like less intense or even more intense, this is just the distance that you walk your talent in and out of the light. But I was mainly focusing on like keeping an interest on third and then the other third, and then building interest with my frame in terms of things that were basically giving me more depth. And then we jump to this. This is kind of more considered a little bit flat just because this is more of a profile shot, but we're more considering the story in this case and not necessarily the cinematography. A lot of times when you're trying to get good scene coverage, not every shot is going to be beautiful, but every shot should have intention of telling a story. If I look at this, yeah, I have interest with all these kind of light and dark patches here, but this is inherently a very flat image because there's a lot going on. And my focus plane is here, but there's everything that is just flat. Those are what profile shots are usually. And because I'm so far away on a long lens, again, this is the 135, I'm basically set at somewhere between where they are and infinity, and then kind of everything is in focus. It's still a beautiful shot, but when we compare it to something like a medium close-up like this, or this other one, or this other wide shot where we built the depth and interest with everything in the frame, it's not as basically deemed cinematic. But again, we're focused on the story of her walking out, this genuine reaction, them excited to see each other, and then going on for this date. We had a bunch of lenses in our kit, and then we only brought one case with us. So we could have swapped to anything, but I want to keep it on the 40 because it is a focal length that I love and that I love to play with, especially getting these tight shots as well as getting these mediums of us walking together. So these were generally all flowing on an easy rig to give you that handheld watching feel. And then this was just me walking with them as they're coming down here. And then if we look at lighting position and everything like that, I'd say he is in the perfect position to give us as much interest and contrast on our subject because we get that natural Rembrandt lighting as well as the light and then dark parts on his face. But then if you look at her, she's more of a top lit source while he is more like a 45 degree, which is more pleasing to the eye. So she's a little bit more flat, but just due to the interest and everything that's going on here, this is very usable and able to work with. I still get some contrast on their side of the face, and this is more than enough to work with as we're kind of driving the narrative forward. So this was our first scene, and this sets up everything. And this was actually the first shots in the piece that we really liked and told the story of what this whole piece was, that people are coming together. So that's an important thing to really kind of dive into the narrative. And we kind of cut back between this. We basically tell the story of him being by himself, and then we play out the story later when they actually meet up. And then we go to the next scene, which was them going on a date. And this is kind of a jump in time, and it's okay to do that. Some people might argue that like, oh, you need to have them at bike racks picking up bikes. And then I kind of pointed that out to the director of like, hey, these are not criticisms. They're just like, hey, do you want the story to be completely flushed out where you see the action of everything? He's like, no, we just need to jump to it. I think there's already enough story and a lot of back things that people can assume, and then the story is fleshed out enough that we don't need those in-between moments. You could 100% do that where their bikes are on the floor and they pick them up, and then you could go into these riding scenes. But I believe that this is more than enough to give you enough context. We already established that they're together and they're about to do an activity, which is this bike ride here. So this was an interesting one because we wanted that watching feel as well as going into it and really positioning everything. So if I kind of draw out what this actually looked like on set, we kind of had this path and a bunch of trees scattered in between, as you can see here. And we shot this basically 3 times. We originally had our position based on CAD Rage and everything like that, where we wanted to shoot this based on the location scout. And then this was roughly where a camera was sitting the first time. I'm just on sticks and I'm panning with them, but I am shooting at 180 focal length. And then these are full frame lenses. So shooting at 6K gives me 180 millimeters. But we were shooting at 4K, which crops into the sensor. In combination with the 180 and the 4K, I believe this is like a 1.33 crop. So this kind of gives me like a 235 instead, which is kind of cheat code and what I like to do when I'm trying to get really long shots. But even this isn't long enough for those super compressed things that you're trying to get. But this was more than enough for this context of this project here. They're coming through this bike path here, and I'm sitting here on the camera. So we shot this once of kind of getting this profile. So that kind of gave you this shot over here. So I'm going to consider this camera angle 1, and this is the corresponding to that. When we were shooting this, the director was like, I want to see more of their faces because we only kind of see his face when he looks over. And we want to still see that in the telephoto. So I made the suggestion, why don't we just move over here, reshoot it, so we have both options, kind of moving quickly on our feet. And then this is just panning across this. And then obviously when we get to here, it's just like almost impossible to track them because they're moving so fast relative to the distance of the camera. So this was our camera position 2. And then this gave me these shots as well as these right here. So it's more frontal and more face, so you can actually see the reactions and everything like that. And this is just kind of scene coverage of like, we only wanted the wide of them riding the bikes. And then it was like a kind of thrown in kind of bonus here of getting a medium of them talking. Because like, I'm very comfortable with riding even on dirt roads or anything like that, but especially pavement, that's what I'm usually riding on. But to get this shot here, which is number 3, I had to ride the Segway on the grass part, and then there was a bunch of pine cones and everything, and it was me riding with them the whole time. So for this, I shot this on a 25 millimeter and I cropped into 4K because we tried a 25 and it was a little too much. And then we didn't want to do a lens swap because we were kind of rushing at that point. So this kind of gives me a 35 to a 40 millimeter. I don't know the exact one for that one. This was kind of that feeling, and you can see that with the slight compression that we see there. It doesn't feel like exactly like a 25. So this is just me running, not running, on the Segway beside them and with an easy rig with the Venice. A very sketchy setup, and especially if you just look on the grass, how uneven it is and everything like that. So this was just me running it multiple times without a camera, getting comfortable enough, and then doing it a couple times with these takes. And then we just got this reaction shots of them kind of looking and having a conversation, everything like that. When we went into the scene, we only wanted one establishing shot of them riding the bikes, and then everything else was extra. And then when we actually came to the edit, none of these shots were used, only one of the telephotos just to tell that they were riding the bikes. Not this really interaction, because we have that in another scene later that felt a lot better. This kind of felt a little jarring because we want to have the emotion of them necessarily having fun, not necessarily having a full-on conversation right here, as you can see with them kind of talking to each other. We want the real moments of, what you see in kind of nostalgic commercials of people riding on bikes. Because I even had that experience when I used to skateboard a lot with my brother and his friends. It would be like the sun was setting and when we'd just be laughing and going down street roads and just having fun. So that was kind of the feeling that we're trying to create, and a conversation really didn't make sense in this point, and that's why I didn't make it to the edit. And when it comes to continuity, this is one of the most important rules that you'll learn as a filmmaker or cinematographer, which is the 180-degree rule, or basically not breaking your axis. So basically, when you start your scene and you are looking to establish your wide shot, you are setting which side of the talent you're shooting on. If I explain that by a diagram, we have our 2 talent having a conversation. And what you want to do is draw an imaginary line between them, and that is where your camera is going to stay. It's either going to stay on this side the entire time or this side the entire time. it's never gonna jump between the two because that's when you start breaking the axis. So when I started off with the wide, this is my first camera position and I'm establishing my axis right here. So this is the line that I'm shooting on and I'm only going to be staying on this side. If I jump the axis and start shooting here, and I'll give you an example of not necessarily what that looks like, but talking about it with this cross coverage, is it's gonna look very weird in the edit. So this is my camera position 1. And then when I move in for the tights here, this is just classic cross coverage. And this is what is the fundamentals of what you're taught about how to cover a scene, especially when 2 people are talking. This is my camera position 2 and 3. And that's how we got all the other inserts, which I'll be talking about later too. This relates to this position here too. This is number 3, and then this is number 1. So we've established that the camera is on basically this side of the actors over here. And if I were to cross that, it would look really weird because if you imagine that these shots were kind of reversed and that we see his shoulder on this side, it's not necessarily something that you can explain. You would have to see it. We'll probably cover a whole YouTube video about that, of what wrong coverage looks like and how it looks like in the edit. But it's so jarring and you kind of get confused because you don't necessarily know where to look when kind of cutting between the two. So if I were to kind of have a conversation of these two back and forth and I had these 2 shots cut between each other, right now my eyes are drawn to here and then I'm looking at her, whatever line she's supposed to say, and I know that he is over here. And then once we cut to this in the edit, if he was on the other side, I'd be like, I just saw him on that side. That doesn't make sense. I already have context that he is supposed to be on the opposite side of her. And that's what the whole thing about continuity is. And I remember when I did this once and I got into post, I'd be like, oh, I broke the axis because I had to shoot a reaction shot back and it didn't look good and I had to flip a lot of things in post and ultimately it was very jarring. So this is just, remember, when you're any shooting, it's the same thing about establishing a shadow side, is that you always want to stay on that shadow, and we establish that in the wide. The next thing I kind of want to talk about this scene is shooting inserts, and that's what really drives kind of how you get in and out of scenes, especially when we use this in edit. We didn't necessarily use this insert, but we used like a kind of, if the camera was kind of here, creeping around like 2 feet off the floor, kind of pushing into here slowly. That's the shot we use that set the tone. Because if you do that, it says the activity that's happening, and then you can jump to anything in the scene necessarily. If I jump to the wide, it would still work and do the cross coverage, but this is not necessarily a short film or anything that we need that. It's a commercial that we can cut to little inserts that really drive the narrative forward. And that really helps in the editing process. And when you're shooting these scenes, it's very important because a lot of people would just shoot 1, 2, and 3 and not necessarily in between, maybe the hands and everything like that. But shoot details of the bikes, shoot details of their foots kind of tapping or his hand tapping against his basically pants over here, or like a medium shot of pushing into the bikes of them just kind of sitting in their positions. And it just tells that they're having a conversation and they're very comfortable with each other. But in a situation that they weren't comfortable with each other, you could easily tell that through inserts by one of the characters maybe nervously tapping their foot or tapping their pants or something like that, or even playing with something that just is very awkward. You can get so many emotions and so many different things across when you're shooting different scenes. So it's just something that's very important to consider. And once I started shooting these inserts in my commercials, it just made the editing process so much easier. The last scene in the sequence that we're going to be talking about is a very important one because we kind of had to light this. Because if you look back to the previous scene, you can see that this was very overcast day, and then they're kind of walking towards there to have this kind of picnic thing. And we kind of had to add some lights because we didn't really feel like this was hitting what the mark that was supposed to. And we actually had to add some contrast in here too. So when we talk about kind of continuity, we've gone through that. I want to start talking about lighting continuity, especially establishing that in your wide. So even if we go back to our wide and kind of go into where do you position yourself to set you up for success, especially in this area here that we're going to. I'm looking for where my dark part is going to be and where my light part is going to be. And especially in this image, it automatically tells you that. I have a bunch of light coming from basically all the overcast over here. And this giant tree coverage is going to act as my neg. We can actually see that negative fill right kind of here. So this is kind of the side that I'm going to stay on, and that where kind of my shadow side is going to be and what I'm going to be shooting on, because shooting on the shadow side gives you the most interest. And now it's basically adding my own lights and then also adding my own modifiers. In this case, because I'm outside, I'm really only going to use neg because it's just so overcast to really help that feeling. And then if we look at just generally of what this looks and feels like, if you look at her face, it's very bright. If you look at his face, it's very bright because all this light is just coming in. And on a wide lens, this is on a 14 mil up high, I don't have any room to really add anything or subtract anything. It's just setting the scene and letting necessarily the story talk for itself. But then, as you notice, as we move in for the tights, where did all this contrast come from? Where did all the shape on their faces really come from, right? And I'm establishing that continuity basically with this subtle hint right here that, oh, the viewer knows that this is light, this is dark. I'm gonna keep that whole concept in mind going throughout the whole scene. Of course, I'm gonna not break the axis and stay on one side, but also I'm gonna establish that my shadow is gonna stay on that side too. It's not just necessarily continuity with your camera positioning and blocking, it's also continuity with your lighting, which is super important. And what we did with that is we actually had two things in play here, which was a 600C Pro 2, as well as just a floppy tinted off, really above them, blocking out a bunch of the light. So off in this corner, I'm just gonna start off with the easiest one to really look at. I have a 600C, and this is with a Fresnel, so this kind of gives me a little bit more punch. And this was set at 100% just to what we were dealing with, and 5600 Kelvin, because I'm just matching the daylight that is all around us. So that is kind of lifting her side of the face, and then you can actually see that little catch light in her eye. We're dealing with a point source. I would have loved to have an M40 and then basically a big 20 by and blast through that, so I'd give a massive catch light. But again, this was a montage commercial. We're moving pretty fast and we're using this light basically on V-mounts. And then every time we were rolling, I would have my gaffer turn it on. And every time that we would cut, I had my gaffer turn it off because I just didn't want to burn through batteries, and I knew that this was going to be quick and a new battery is going to be enough. I didn't need a full-on generator to do that. And that's why I love to use aperture lights. And then on this side, to add a little bit more contrast, we actually tinted a floppy entirely over, which I was very surprised with how close we had to get this, because at some point it was almost running and interfering on the camera. And this is giving me some contrast back into her shadow side of the face, where we established that. And then she's getting the natural Rembrandt lighting from all the soft, as well as getting a nice edge. So basically we have all this soft light coming in, and then on the edge of her face, which gets popped out a little bit, that's where the 600C is kind of kicking in. So that is me playing with my shadow side and then my light side as well. And then we did the same thing, is we kept that 600C Pro kind of position on the same side, same settings as we had here. We kind of had a roller stand, and then every shot that we're kind of getting, I just kind of had my gaffer keep it on this one side here. On this side, it's here. This side, it's over here. And on this side, which we're going to talk about later, it's on there as well. But again, we get that soft light, and then we get a kind of a punch on the edges of their face, which kind of brings everything up. And then we also just kept that floppy there, trying to give us more contrast and everything here. So that's just really picking one side and then keeping that with that. If I put that light over here and started up, and if I want to pop her out and then establish that the shadow is over here, but then I would get a total different lighting continuity if we look at his face here to here, and then if we look at her face here to here. I'm gonna keep that shadow on this side, I'm gonna keep the highlight on that side of her face and not pop out the back of her hair. And we established that in the wide. And then we did the kind of same thing here where we had that floppy kind of tinted over. And then here you can kind of see that kiss of light that we have. I like working with multiple different light sources. In this case, I'm working with the soft light that kind of gives you that naturalistic and very soft lighting. And then here we're dealing with a low contrast ratio. But if you look over here, we get that light, nice patches of bright light and then popping out his ear and the back of his head just to give us some night interest. When you talk about interest, when you talk about contrast, especially when it comes to lighting, I'm trying to constantly build a checkerboard of color as well as just light and dark. Here, the background is super light just due to that we're in a bright sunny day and that these two are under a tree. So that's perfect for my contrast. I get a nice pop of light here that's kind of slightly brighter than the background. And then I get a nice shadow on the majority of his face, which goes into a nice gradient of going to a lighter. So again, we have that light, even lighter, dark, light, and then even lighter again, and then kind of something mixed in between. It's not necessarily always going to be a checkerboard planning of light, dark, light, dark. You're kind of mixed all over the place. It's kind of like a mosaic But if you establish that you have kind of one light, then a dark, and then another light, that's what we're talking about when it comes to the checkerboard of contrast, especially when we're talking about light and dark. When it comes to kind of telling a narrative story and making these really simple things feel larger than life, continuity is so important because you don't want to have something that's super jarring that takes you out of the world. We're trying to put our viewer in the world and not necessarily have any mistakes that take it out. So a big thing is continuity of your framing and then just making sure that everything flows like that, as well as something that's not as important when it comes to framing, but more on the technical side, which is lighting. You don't want to have your lights start to jump all over the place. Only people will really notice that if they know cinematography or if they know filmmaking. But these are the little details that really blend everything together, especially when you're going in the edit. And that's how you kind of jump between scenes. Hope you guys enjoyed this breakdown. If you want more breakdowns like this, where I go into basic concepts and apply them to the commercials that we shoot, let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching.